Thank you very much, Natalia, and hello everyone. Greetings from the sunny Cayman Islands. Henry Ford said that anyone who keeps learning stays young. So I think that's my main credential for being included in the amazing, youthful and dynamic group of postgraduate students who are the new paradigm navigators and new generations of researchers. Because I think if it were a criteria determined by how many candles I could cram onto my birthday cake, I would probably be disqualified by now. So thank you so much for inviting me to speak. I'm deeply honoured, and huge thanks to Louise and all the core team of the new paradigm navigators. I do have an insight into just how much work and thought and effort had to go into putting this together. So huge thanks to all of you.
You're most welcome, regardless of the age. A new paradigm navigator can be as little as my kids, or a baby, or as big as 100-year-old. So come along.
Very good. Thank you. Now I'm going to retrieve my slideshow. And slideshow from beginning. Now, hopefully I'm sharing my screen and you can all see that? Very good. So already Natalia's introduced me. So I'm in year one of my PhD research, and my personal mission impossible that I have chosen to accept is to arrive at an interdisciplinary, integral, unifying theory of consciousness, bringing together consciousness with psychology, philosophy of mind, neuroscience, quantum physics, and mysticism. So as you can see, I've set myself just a little task. And I'm obviously at the fairly early stages of a very exciting scholarly journey. So in this talk, I want to share some of my earliest findings and where I've got to so far in looking into the mysteries of consciousness. There was a lovely quote from Sherry about consciousness remaining mysterious, which is obviously what I'm talking about today. Now, if there were time and space enough to do a quick straw poll of all 79 people attending on the Zoom right now, about what you each understood about consciousness, I'm pretty certain I would get equally about 79 different answers. And, you know, it's obviously a naive stance to assume with language that we're all intending the same meaning when we talk about specific things. So it reminds me of an old joke, which goes something like this. I'm going to ask what might seem to be an easy question. What's 2 plus 2? Now, of course, you know, we all know the answer to that, but it depends who you're asking. If you ask a city trader, what's 2 plus 2? They'll say, are we buying or are we selling? Now, if you ask a lawyer, what's 2 plus 2? They'll say, well, it's an integer between 2 and 6 and optimally between 3 and 5. And if you ask an accountant what's 2 and 2, they'll say, well, what do you want it to equal? So sorry, it's about poor joke against accountants. I hope I haven't offended any here. But it's a bit like with consciousness. You go around saying, well, what's consciousness? And we ask our usual friends, family. People come up with something like, well, it's the thoughts in my head. It's my sense of awareness and what I'm perceiving in the world. And some people might think of it in terms of my sense of a soul or the living spark of the source energy that's in me. And, you know, what struck me at the very outset of studying consciousness is that it's absolutely not a clearly defined concept. It is much more multidimensional. It's actually a kind of umbrella term, a canopy under which all sorts of ideas can be covered. So if I go, having sort of asked friends and family what they think consciousness might be, I go and talk to a neuroscientist who's of the materialist and physicalist bent and say, well, what do you think it is? They'll say, well, it's just an epiphenomenon, a byproduct of brain activity. And basically, according to Francis Crick, he of the DNA double helix fame, you're nothing but a pack of neurons. And then if I went off inquiring of the clever philosophy of mind professors, they would start throwing isms at me. Monism, dualism, idealism, panpsychism, and it would all be quite perplexing. But then if I start to speak to quantum physicists, and even Max Planck himself, the father of quantum physics, and say, well, what's consciousness? They'd be saying, well, consciousness is fundamental. It's a primordial property of the universe, the cosmic stuff. You know, Wolfgang Pauli and Carl Jung developed a whole idea of physics and psychology being unified by a common transcendental source energy they called the unus mundus. And then finally, if I start talking to mystics about consciousness, they will also be talking about a form of pure consciousness. So it seems that it struck me immediately when I began looking into consciousness research that different scholars seem to be talking past each other for lack of common assumptions. So I thought, let me try and unravel these mysteries a little more. And I've come up with my own model of consciousness, a hierarchy of consciousness. Now, a professor at CIIS introduced me to this idea of something called model agnosticism. And what that means is in all systems of knowledge, models are just maps to make sense of a confusing world, like the confusing world of consciousness. And any model is an approximation of reality. It's not a reality itself, obviously. And I'm not claiming this model is completely true, nor saying it could be completely false, but all models sort of fall on a spectrum of more or less useful in understanding and engaging with the phenomenon it models. So I wanted to find for myself a model that would help me engage with the field of consciousness and getting an understanding of it. And as Natalia said when introducing me, I have a background in law. For the past 35 years, my day job has been to be a commercial barrister and an offshore litigation attorney. And when presenting cases to a court, you need to structure information and one's arguments. So the very idea of me going into a courtroom and saying, well, my lord, oh, it's all very contentious. You know, there's plenty of evidence on all the sides of the debate, and there's no common ground about what anything means. But could I have a ruling about consciousness? You know, I would get thrown out of that courtroom because it would just be all too fuzzy and unclear. So the model I've come up with is, it struck me that when reading and researching into the area of consciousness, different scholars seem to be talking about different things. Now, the most obvious one is towards the bottom, individual consciousness. I'm calling it the ego ozone, for reasons I'll explain in a second. That's our subjective awareness. That's the thoughts in our head, our own perceptions, how we're operating in the world. And that's all very intuitively, instinctively graspable to all of us. Now, I have developed my own concept of the ego ozone because my theory is about us being surrounded by a psychophysical barrier, or the filters and screening processes of the brain that keep us from perceptions of broader bandwidths of frequencies of consciousness. I should explain that each of these interactive tiers of consciousness represents a specific frequency or vibration. So if, for example, I were talking to those who are mediums or clairvoyants or have telepathic skills, they would very much be recognizing a form of consciousness well beyond the individual brain, but a type of consciousness that's much more collective, that we can tune into and tap into and discover. And then at the even more primordial level, there's a form of consciousness that I think of as the cosmic stuff. I'm told by the scientist Stefan Schwartz that I shouldn't be using the word energy. Energy is misleading in physics now. It's all information. But information doesn't really speak to me as a term. We've got to find labels for things. But I think of the cosmic pan-consciousness is what the mystics are talking about. In Sherry's talk, when she's talking about the light, going to the light, it's the ineffable, it's the undifferentiated source consciousness. And what I'm going to go, and I will be talking through these different levels of consciousness in my talk, but what I'm not going to be touching at all is the so-called inverse hard problem of consciousness, which is the alchemical process by which consciousness, wave functions, and the wave function quantum physics interacts with the macro world to create reality. I'm not going to touch that, and it's quite at the periphery of my understanding anyway. So starting off with the type of consciousness that we're all very familiar with, the thoughts in our head. And on this slide, I've just gathered all the usual sort of labels that we can apply to our own subjective sense of localized consciousness. And I've also, on the right-hand side, you see also expanded this to some of the terminology where I think over quite a few hundred years, what was being called the soul is what in now we would more likely call consciousness. Consciousness only popped up as a term in the 17th century. So I see in many mystical traditions when people are talking about the soul or the psyche, and even also our consciousness as a shield or a barrier from something bigger and beyond the more, then I'm thinking of the ego ozone as something very similar to what is the Maya veils of illusion, or has been referred to as the clouds of unknowing. Now, a very important concept is that the brain and nervous system, from the research I've already looked at, have already uncovered, is, to my mind, an instrument of consciousness and not a generator of consciousness. And that's going to be a very key point for this whole model that I'm trying to introduce. And it's clear that, and very well established, that the brain hugely filters and limits the incoming amount of sensory information from our own perceptual awareness. So, for example, again, everybody on this call, we've all are processing or receiving into our brain about 40 million bits of sensory information per second into 40 million bits. And yet what we're capable of perceiving is, so nice neuroscientists say, closer to 8,000 bits of that huge amount of information. So it's quite obvious we're already cutting out a huge portion of the world that might be available to us, or levels or dimensions of awareness that might be accessible. And you've probably all heard of the lovely Aldous Huxley quote, which is, to make biological survival possible, mind at large has to be funneled through the reducing valve of the brain and nervous system. What comes out at the other end is a measly trickle of the kind of consciousness that will help us stay alive on the surface of this particular planet. And what neuroscience now knows and can prove are the networks by which we create these filters and screens. Now, the first type is the sensory filter. And these are the inputs such as sounds and frequencies of light that canalize vibratory information. So, you know, we've all had those debates with friends, like, that's green. No, it's not, it's blue. Well, I call that green. You know, we can't even agree with those closest to us what a different type of color might be. And it's also, when we look to the superpowers of the animal kingdom, it's quite clear that we as human beings have rubbish senses compared to some superpowers that the animal world has. Like the platypus has electroreception and can detect the electrical impulses of its prey. You know, more obviously, dogs hear frequencies of sound well outside the scope of we can hear. And I found out there's a type of shrimp that has 16 types of photoreceptors that's picking up colors and ultraviolet well beyond, and so on and so on. Bats with their echolocation, snakes who can detect infrared. We're only getting a fraction of what even the animal kingdom can perceive. And then we have our perceptual and linguistic filters, which come from a part of the brain apparatus called the default mode network. And this really refracts our thoughts, and it filters what we're perceiving, or it may enhance reality. It depends what we choose to focus on. It depends how we're also describing reality to ourselves. And the default mode network is actually key for our own sense of identity and who we are in the world. We have going on in our brains the total, and we see it again with the higher attention level filters, these background narratives and stories explaining the world to ourselves, choosing what we're seeing in the world. I mean, one example of these higher level filters is, you probably all had similar experiences. There might be something you've never specially noticed before. Like in 2012, I decided to buy a little Fiat 500 car when I was in London. Nice bright blue Fiat. Suddenly on the roads, Fiat 500s are everywhere in London. Crowding London, blue Fiat 500. Everywhere I look, I'm suddenly seeing Fiat 500s, whereas before, never noticed them. They just weren't part of my awareness up until that point. Then we have, again, another brain network called the thalamocortical loop. It was reverberating, and this is where a higher cognitive center, which prioritizes our own entrenched beliefs and self-referential thoughts over what might be fresh external sensory inputs. So when we think of how happy children are in the world, where they have that, the world is enchanted, the world is magical, they still have that porosity or permeability. And then we as adults, the older we get more self-absorbed, we get entrenched in our own ideas, and we begin to shut ourselves off from potentially levels of enchantment. And the last type of filter is, this is something Ian McGilchrist is, of course, well known for, this left brain dominance, where we are thinking very much rationally and linearly and not so much about novelty and wholeness and intuition. So the upshot of all of this is that we are limiting the world to a specific range of energy frequencies that we are tuning into. And I'm very excited by some research coming out of neuroscience now that is starting to show the brain as this instrument of consciousness, not a generator of consciousness, or not even synonymous with consciousness. It's very much more about the brain as a frequency vibrational interface. That's the research of Diane Powell, and that we are both generating certain electromagnetic fields and responding to fields. And Diane Powell makes a very pragmatic point about consciousness when she says the nature of consciousness is still hotly debated, but no one thinks consciousness consists of matter. That means consciousness is either a form of energy or it's a type of field. And then if we're deciding, well, is it energy or a field, we could say, well, if it's a form of energy rather than a field, the skull is not a very effective means of preventing its leakage, because it's also, well known that that we have EEGs to measure the electromagnetism of a field of electromagnetic energy emitting from our skulls. And even more exciting, I think, is the research into the brain as a quantum biocomputer processing information as coherent light. And I think this really began in the 90s with Sir Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff coming up with this idea of microtubule proteins, tiny little canals in the brain, as biological superconductors. And this would boost the brain's computing power by holding different superpositions between states. And then the research has now advanced to suggest that the microtubules may be acting as quantum microprocessors, which are transmitting coherent light as a means of encoding information. And even that holographic images are being encoded through this biological information by microtubules. And when I read that, I could also tie up that research on the one hand with some also fairly old research from a German biophysicist, Fritz Alfred Popp, Albert Popp rather, who came up with a biophysical theory of biophotons in DNA. And his theory is that photons are a universal medium of information and communication. And his theory is that quantum coherence allows information to flow as coherent light within DNA through and from all the psychobiological structures and the quantum information field. And I'll talk about DNA again. I have my own little theory. And then when we add on to that, now the glial cells are shown by MRI imaging to be the main integrators of information, being highly interconnected and thus able to provide a fast means of distributing information. Where we get to from all of this is that these systems in the brain don't just merely have a structural function. They're doing something much more. They are the interface between vibrating fields of energy and operating on quantum levels. And I'll share my own little pet theory that this is just totally my own, and I maybe in a few years' time, when I'm further into my PhD, I'll be able to substantiate this. But I like to have this idea that DNA stands for divine network access, and that it's not a closed loop. And then spiraling up and down the double helix are these biophotons of coherent light communicating between us and the collective consciousness, the quantum information field, and connecting us to pan-cosmic consciousness. That through ever subtle levels of energy, I think it's the DNA is the connection point. And
Sarah, just to make you aware that you have 4 minutes left.
4? Oh, gosh, my goodness. I don't know where time has disappeared to. My word. Then I have overrun. So my theory of a collective consciousness, that is this idea of a cosmic cloud that we are all effectively uploading into, downloading from, and interconnecting with. And this also fits in with these very old ideas of the anima mundi, the world soul, Akashic records, Rupert Sheldrake's lovely ideas of morphic resonance. And in the most recent Paradigm Explorer, Irvin Laszlo is talking about the quantum Akashic holofield, which is this idea of it's almost like the psychic storage of every thought, every feeling is being uploaded into this as an ocean of ultra information, is the research of Paul Muñoz, a neuroscientist. And it's a field which we can access by by resonant connections. I'm sorry, I mistimed this completely. And basically, Paul Nunez's theory is that how shall I put it? Our neural networks are bound by resonance operating on certain frequency bands. So we have the frequency band that's just ourselves, but it means every consciousness has its own frequency band. And that offers us a means of being able to tap into the frequency of other consciousness, non-temporally, non-locally. It could be people who are no longer in physical. And this ability to tune by resonance into the collective consciousness of anyone is really what explains all the anomalies of consciousness, mediumship, telepathy, clairvoyance, and so forth, and allows us, if we want to access the genius of Bohm or Einstein or Carl Jung, we can tune into them as well. So the last type of consciousness I've got about 2 minutes to describe is cosmic pan-consciousness, numinous source energy, or the cosmic stuff, if I'm not allowed to use the word energy. And what physicists know about this type of energy is this. They're calling it dark stuff, dark matter, dark energy, because nobody really knows what it is. And if you ask mystics, well, what's the numinous, ineffable energy? What's the Tao? Then this slide pretty much captures what a mystic might tell us about pan-cosmic energy. So I've seen many different terms for this type of consciousness that because I'm running out of time, I'm putting on this one slide, and you can see many of the mystical terms as well.
Take another 2 minutes. Don't worry. We have a little more time.
Well, thank you. So my theory then is that this type of source energy it's undifferentiated, it's numinous, it's coming through our own individual consciousness being refracted and imprinted by us, and from us it's uploading to the a cosmic cloud equivalent of a collective form of consciousness. And Max Planck said back in the 1930s, he regarded consciousness as fundamental and regarded matter as derivative of consciousness, and that conscious can't get behind consciousness, everything postulates it. And then the last thing I would mention is that at the very beginning, I promise is the only equation I will ever mention of quantum physics, Max Planck kicked it off with his own the Planck constant equation, E equals hv. Quite an easy little equation, and it stands, E is energy or light, H is the Planck constant, and V stands for vibration or frequency. And I interpret that equation as meaning cosmic pan consciousness is constant, permeating all time and all space, but it is modulated or differentiated into separate units or quantas or variable frequencies, both individually and then us embedded into a collective consciousness. And that to me really ties in with the Nikola Tesla comment of, if you want to find the secrets of the universe, think in terms of energy, frequency, and vibration. And the last comment then I will make is, I won't go for that. What was I going to? Oh gosh, I'm sorry. I've lost my thought as to the last comment I was going to make. Anyway, I think I'm out of time, so I'm so sorry. When I was practicing it earlier, I managed to speak very fast and squash all of that into 20 minutes. But obviously, I've taken a little longer. But thank you all for your time and attention.